saw how that changes then the way philosophy is done in China versus the way it was done in the West. So Confucius' solution was a traditionalist solution. It was to return to what worked in the past. Seems obvious. If it was something that was occurring in the past and it was harmonious and it was working well, then let's go see what they did and do it again. And of course, Confucius then says that what worked was this ritualization of human interaction, this transference of the reverence we give to the gods through ritual and sacrifice to reverence that we give to each other in our interpersonal relationships. So his model was ritual, right? Ritual behavior, ritual politeness. And then we saw that because humans are not these atoms, but are actually nodes on a web of relation, then what is right for each situation is going to depend on who you are in that interaction. It's all about the roles in society. But unlike you and I, we think of roles as things that we interchange, right? Things that, like, I'm a father, but I'm also a son, but I'm also a professor, and I'm also a friend. And we think of those as things that we exist in, but we can interchange. But in Confucianism and in Chinese culture, no, the roles are what make me who I am. They're not like masks that I put on and then take off. To take off the role of father is to actually cut a limb off rather than simply change expectations. And so we saw that defining right and wrong for Confucius was defining what is fitting in that relationship. And that was what this picture was supposed to give us. And the question is, how do I determine that, right? How do I determine the fitting action and therefore the fitting external ritual that will express that action and that attitude in the right way? And for Confucius, it was all about these two mindsets, okay? The one is this one right here, okay? This is what Confucius would say is the one thread that runs through his entire philosophy. It's pronounced as shu, okay? Shu. And the idea behind it is this, that when I am trying to determine what is the right thing to do in a particular situation with a particular person, I need to be able to take what is inside of me, my own personal feelings, and apply them to that other person. So this idea of shu is often translated as reciprocity. But reciprocity is a terrible translation. Because when you think of reciprocity, you think of what? Tit for tat. You do this for me, I do that for you, and then we obligate each other by means of that. That's not what this means at all. The idea behind it is you have two parts to this character. The first part here is rule, and rule means likeness or similarity. Okay? And this is the radical for the heart-mind. So the place where you perceive. And so the best translationing is analogical thinking, or what you could say likening. Okay? So the idea is this. To give you an example, is Confucius was having a conversation with a stranger about how long should we mourn for our parents. Now, for the Chinese, the mourning period was really important to show respect for your parents. And in Chinese mourning ritual, everybody wore white. Okay? So you can imagine when Western weddings come around and everybody's wearing white, it's like, that's terrible. So, but the idea was you expressed your reverence for your parents by, in the Confucian idea, for 3 years, you did practically nothing. You were in mourning. And so, of course, remember the Confucians were debating with the Moists, and the Moists were very practical engineers and from the lower class, and they said, if you do this, society is going to collapse. You elitists, you could do that because you have enough money to take a vacation, right? Take a sabbatical or whatever. And so he was discussing this with a Moist who said, I think at most a couple weeks. Why 3 years? And this was Confucius's response. He said, if you were to, using this term right here, if you were to liken yourself and put yourself in your parents', your mother's and father's position for the first 3 years of your life. Now, how many have been parents, right? Okay. Now, you know that in those first years, you are at the beck and call of your children, aren't you? No matter, they cry in the middle of the night, you're not like, shut up, I'm going back to sleep. Is that what you're going to do? No, you're up. If they are sick, you're taking a vacation to take care of them, right? Everything, their whole first 3 years, especially because at that time you had to wean the child, right? You couldn't feed them formula or things like that. You had to be totally at their service. And therefore, the first 3 years, if they survived those 3 years, because infant mortality was pretty great, then what would happen? Then you pretty much gave yourself to them completely. Your life they were the center of your life. True? So he said, if you put yourself in your parents' position, right? If you likened your position to theirs, then what would happen is you would want to mourn for 3 years as a way of paying them back, as a way of understanding. So it's putting the easiest way to say it is the whole operation of understanding what the right rituals and fitting behavior is to put yourself in the shoes, your mind and heart in sympathy with the person you're interacting with, in their role. And then what happens is the right kind of feelings will arise, you see? The right kind of sympathies. And then once those feelings arise, okay, because you're able to externalize that, you're both in their shoes and interacting with them, then you'd be able to say, well, what would I want them to do to me if I was like this? What rule does this start to sound like? The golden rule. And in fact, Confucius came up with a negative version of it, okay? It's 己所不欲，勿施于人. Do not do to others what you would not have them do to you. Okay? And he says that's the essence of likening. Okay? But unlike our idea of the golden rule, okay? Our idea of the golden rule is very personalized. In other words, our idea is I think about what I would like, and then I do it to other people, right? And the problem is because we're all individuals, that often goes wrong, doesn't it? This kind of likening. How many have people who they've given you gifts for Christmas or your holidays and stuff, and they give you things that they would have liked to have gotten, right? Like my mom loves Beanie Babies. How many of you ever heard of Beanie Babies? Remember those things? She has like 3 million of them. And so every time she gives gifts, it's stuff like that. And I am like my wife is the exact opposite of that. She hates clutter. She hates these little knickknacks. And so then what do? You get these Beanie Babies. She gets these Beanie Babies, and my mom is like, isn't this great? And my mom's, yeah, that. Right? She's doing unto others what she would have done to her. But what Confucius is saying is something different. He's saying, no, what you have to do is you have to realize that there needs to be these expectations that are unified in society. Okay? We're individuals, and so because we're individuals, that doesn't work very well, you see? But if it turns out that you cultivate through ritual and the atmosphere the right kinds of expectations from everybody in the right roles, then this works. See this? So thus, what we want to do is I want to read you a passage that really is essential for understanding the Confucian solution. It's not simply interpersonal relations, it's this interpersonal relations create this web or network that standardizes the way people deal with each other. Not just in the external behavior, but in their feelings toward each other. So thus what we see is this interplay between inner and outer. Okay? You and I were always thinking in terms of what's going on the inside, and then it is expressed by what we do on the outside, right? Like Jesus said, right? That it's not what comes from outside of a man, right, that makes him unclean, but what? What comes out, right? All sorts of thoughts. See, that's a very Western idea. For Confucius and for those like him, the inside and the outside are mutually interpenetrating. So that because of all my relations, because of the rituals and the ceremonies, they create external atmospheres that mold me into what I am before. Remember we talked about Dewey, the I and the me? And then what? And then those then are re-expressed in the right way, in ways that everybody can understand. And then they mutually reinforce each other. Okay? So now Confucius then is given this question. Somebody comes to him and says, all right, let's say we give you the government. Because of course that's what he's advocating for, right? He's like, let me be in charge and I will show you how to get back. And so one day somebody says to him, okay, what if we do give you the government? What's the first thing you're going to do? All right, and this is how he responds. He says, well, I would certainly have to rectify the names. Exactly. I paused there because I want you all to puzzle over that. And they did too. Okay, this was the response that this person said. He says, why would you do that? Okay. How is that going to help anything? Because what do we think? We think like Shakespeare, right? A rose by any other name would what? Would smell as sweet, right? It's still a rose, right? A rose is a rose is a rose. This question would have never arose for us, right? Sorry. But and so the thing is Confucius says this. He says to the disciple who said this to him, he says, you are totally uncivilized. You don't understand anything. All right? So let me explain this to you. He said, if the names are not rectified, okay, then communication will not work. Okay? And if communication will not work, then our understanding and our doing of affairs, human affairs, will not succeed. Okay? And if they do not succeed, then ritual propriety will not arise. We're not going to have any kind of mutual civility with each other. And when there's not that ritual propriety, then what's going to happen is our judgments about punishment, what you deserve, and what you don't deserve are going to be off the mark. And if that happens, he said, then no one's going to know where to place their hands or feet. Okay? So now, the interesting thing about this is you're starting to get a sense of it. But first of all, let's understand what he means by names. He doesn't mean things like, okay, what do we call this? A chair. No, could care less about that. He's talking about what's a father? What's a mother? What's a son? What's a citizen? See? In other words, there are certain names that the minute you understand what they mean, they carry with them the understanding of a standard by which you judge them. Isn't that true? So, for example, let us say you and I have a disagreement about what does it mean to be a father. Okay? One of the central roles in all societies. Right? Let's say that I believe a father is just anybody who's a sperm donor. Okay? In other words, just biological father. And you believe, no, to be a father is to be a caregiver, right? Is to be able to raise your children in the right way, to not abandon them, but to be there for them, right? Then you and I, our names are not standardized, are they? So are we going to agree about then how one ought to treat a father? Can't, can we? Because then, let's go back to our whole dilemma about who do we save who's drowning in the lake, right? We go, let's say, let's say we go to the bare minimum definition of father as sperm donor. And let's say my father is drowning there, but also my stepfather is drowning there, and that my stepfather raised me, and I never knew my real father because he could care less. Okay? Who am I going to save? Depends on how I define father. You see that? So thus, we're going to disagree about the very situational description, won't we? See? And we're going to disagree about, even when we communicate, what's going to happen is what's happening in our society right now, isn't it? We're even going to disagree about what we're saying to each other. So we're going to talk past each other. Isn't that our political situation today? A lot of times, we're talking past each other because we don't even have the same concepts of things, okay, of human interaction. And then, if the person, those of you who believe father is the person who raises you, and I save the biological father and allow the one who sacrificed their whole life for me to drown, those people are going to think I'm evil, right? And then the people who believe that, no, look, it's flesh and blood that's the most important thing. You see that? That if I save my stepfather, they say, how dare you let your own father? You see? So then what will happen is we're going to now have disagreement of the obligations that we have toward the same person. And hence, he's saying the most important thing I can do in a society is standardize those roles. Because as we saw, there is no right or wrong apart from where I exist in relation to the people who are interacting in my life. One way to see this is to take a word that we all use all the time. I'm going to call that word responsibility. How many have heard that term before? You all have, right? It's a stupid question. Okay, but here's the interesting thing. When you and I use the term responsibility, we often mean who done it, right? Who is responsible, right, for that? Who's responsible? So our notion of responsibility is the notion of I have control, I have free will, and that's what makes me a moral being, is the decisions I make. And then I take responsibility for them, right? And isn't that what we want to teach our children in our society? To have responsibility? Okay, but now, the English word is a very interesting word. Because what smaller word is in the word responsibility? Response. So to be responsible literally means to be able to respond. Okay? And that's more the Chinese idea in Confucianism. All of my responsibilities are responses to others in what I do or don't. Even the word for I'm sorry in Chinese is very interesting because it has that in it, all right? If I feel regret or guilt because I did something wrong to one of you, then I 对不起你, okay? 对不起 literally means I cannot face you, okay? Because what morality is I encounter others, I encounter their face, and their face demands a response. Their look, their very presence demands a response. Who are you, and what should I do in relation to you? Okay? What response is appropriate? So therefore I have to face you, right? But if I've wronged you, if I haven't had the appropriate response to you, then I cannot respond, you see? I cannot face you. Cannot face you. So you've heard of this notion of face in Asian culture. How many have heard of that before? Now you know where that comes from. It's a shame culture. But what that means is not that everybody's ashamed, okay? What it means is that everybody is living their life in the light of how ought they to respond to the expectations of those who are in their network and therefore deserve the appropriate response. Okay? So, understanding that, we can now talk about Daoism. Okay? I want you to remember the names, okay? Remember the names. Because what Confucius is saying is really then something that leads to a certain type of methodology on how I live my life. Okay? So obviously, since this is about understanding how the Sage King set up society with these rituals and these fitting things, and then perpetuating that so that you have that stability of human relationship and standardization, then of course, that would mean that if I'm going to be a good person, education is going to be the most important thing, isn't it? Okay? And so that's the first verse in the Analects was 学而时习不亦说乎, or to constantly learn, okay? And to constantly put that knowledge into practice, that is the ultimate in flourishing. Okay? He even says, look, I'm a thinker, but if I think without learning, in other words, learning from others, then my thinking is in vain. Okay? But if I learn without thinking, then that's just as bad. Okay? So you have to have this balance that you are an individual thinker, but that individual has to be continuing a flow. Okay? So thus, I need to learn the names, right? I need to learn the roles. I need to understand and learn the ritual. And then I have to become a practitioner of it. Which means that life is all about becoming skillful in interpersonal relations. It's like mastering a craft, except the craft is the craft of being human in society. All right, so now we understand that. Now let me read to you the first verse, okay, in the most famous Taoist piece of literature called The Way of Virtue and Its Power, okay, the Tao Te Ching, okay, you might have heard of it as the Tao Te Ching, or something like that, because it is a direct response to this, So first, I have to read it in the Chinese, precisely because you will hear a word that we've been using, and you will hear it repeated. And the test will be, can you hear what word is being used, all right? Okay. So, 道可道，非常道。Dao. A lot of repetition of that, right? And we saw that debate is all about what the nature of the way, the Tao is. So now the problem with translating these, okay, especially the Tao Te Ching by Laozi, is that it's written in very cryptic poetry, okay? And there's reason behind it. Why he writes in this very cryptic, hard to understand poetry. And this first line tells us why. The best translation of this, that I'm giving sort of my translations of these, and that's what I've been doing the whole time, all right? So if any of it's wrong, it's my fault. Okay, so I'll take responsibility. And, okay, and is that the Tao that can be spoken of, okay, is not the true Tao. The Tao that can be spoken of is not the true Tao. Okay, let me read on. All right. 名可名，非常名. Ming is the word for name. Remember Confucius said, what the first thing I'm going to do? I'm going to correct the names, rectify them, standardize them, right? The word 正名, okay, 正 literally means both to standardize, as in make everything level and the same, but also to correct what was not standardized, okay, in the sense of this. There's a Japanese saying, the nail that sticks up should be hammered down. Right? Makes sense, doesn't it? Anybody ever step on a nail? Oh, because they weren't what? They weren't standardized. Okay? So you have that idea, right? That things can be made the same, uniform. And this is the response. The name that can be named, that can be defined, is not the true name. Okay? So automatically we see the first line in this work is a critique, a conscious, purposeful jab at Confucianism. Okay? Now, why would that be the case? Well, he goes on. He says, look, the nameless is the source of all things. Okay? So what is he talking about? All right, so let's say I don't know English. Let's pretend I don't know English. Right? So I ask you, all right, what is a bachelor? Anybody define bachelor for me? What's a bachelor? What's a bachelor, sir? Anybody? An unmarried man. Okay. All right. Now the problem is I don't know English. So is that going to help me at all? Only if I already know the meaning of unmarried and what? Man. So then I'm going to play really dumb, right? I'm going to say, well, what's a man, right? And what does it mean to be unmarried? And then you're going to have to define that, aren't you? Okay? And if your definition's going to work, it's got to encompass, it's got to reduce what you're defining to some more basic terms, doesn't it? Okay? So every definition eventually has to come to a place where what? Where I define everything down to everything that's already understood, or it doesn't work. Okay? You all agree with that? Okay. In other words, if you say, I ask you what bachelor means, and you say it's 独生子 or something like that, 独生子, you're going to be like, huh? Right? Because you don't know Chinese. So now here's the thing. Now here's the paradox of it. So eventually I'm going to have to come to terms that I can't define. Why? Otherwise you keep going, right? And then there's no explanation, right? Do you see this? You go to infinity, and you can't do that, right? And have any understanding. So eventually you're going to have to come to terms that are undefinable. You see that? But define everything else. Because they have to be the basis for all definition, don't they? So remember, it's our names, our ways of naming things that divide the world up, don't they? So that I don't treat fathers the same as I treat mothers. And I don't treat sons the same as I treat parents. It's like that. I need to be able to have these names distinguishable from each other because they're not just names. We're not just playing a game. We are trying to navigate the world around us, aren't we? And it's through our language that we do so. So thus, different languages are going to divide the world in different ways, aren't they? That's why there are no direct translations of things. Okay? Doesn't mean we can't communicate. But what it means is we have to understand that those names are eventually going to have to be defined by ways of expression that are themselves undefinable. Okay? So thus, the ultimate definition, you see that? The ultimate description of reality has to be through a mode that is indescribable. Thus, the true naming is not going to be able to be standardized, is it? You see this? It can't be. Think of it, if this doesn't help, just think of how many remember doing graphs, right, in math. And you had an equation, right? And the equation, like a quadratic equation, would then allow you to define a shape on a graph, right? That was called analytic geometry. They thanked Descartes for all that terror, okay? And it was, now, the thing is as long as you have the coordinate system, right, the XY coordinate system, then you can define any shape on that coordinate system. But now, can I give the coordinates of the coordinate system? Where do I give it? I can't give it on the same coordinate system, can I? No. So the coordinate system is what allows us to coordinate everything, but it can't be coordinated, can it? See that? All right. So the Tao, which is the true way, right? It's the true way. It's going to be a way that tells us the way. So it itself is going to be like the sun. The sun sheds light on everything, but can I look directly at the sun? Not without going blind. So that which sheds light on everything, allows us to see the path, cannot be illuminated, can it? Something can be so bright, it blinds you. So the Tao that can be Taoed, literally, is not the true Tao. Therefore, Confucius, you telling us all this Tao stuff, you can't be right. You can't be ultimately right. He's not saying you can't be partially right. He's not saying that Confucius doesn't have any wisdom. What he's saying is this can't be the whole story. Okay? Because if it was, it couldn't be basic enough, could it? See? Couldn't be basic enough. It's kind of like talking about God, right? Any description you use of the ultimate is going to be from a finite perspective, isn't it? With your finite words. And so how can it not help but be idolatry? See? So he goes on and he says, the nameless, as we said, is the source of all things. You understand that now, right? Because it's through naming that we pick things out and therefore make them into separate things. Okay? Our naming creates as much as describes. Then he says, 有名万物之母. And he doesn't eliminate names. He goes, the nameless is the source of all things. He says, the named is the mother of all things. So does he give up naming completely? No. He's saying they're like parents. You need the nameless because otherwise there'd be nothing to name. You see? But, so that's the source, right? I'm not naming things out of nowhere. But on the other hand, when I name, I create the object I'm naming. So the best illustration I can think of is actually one that's used in philosophy as a sort of paradox in Western philosophy. I think it really works in this situation. It's, how many remember the statue of David, right? Michelangelo's statue of David. Okay. So now that statue is made of what? Bronze, right? So say nobody knew what the statue of David is, and I'm pointing it out to them. I could go, oh, you see that hunk of bronze over there, shaped like that, like David? That's the statue of David, right? So let's describe it in one way. Let's call it a hunk of bronze. I mean, a hunk of marble. Hunk of marble. Okay, I know I'm losing my marbles. And so, but then we can describe it in another way. We can say it's a statue, right? So when I call it the statue of David, I'm calling it a different thing than when I call it that hunk of marble shaped like David. Yeah. And in fact, I'm defining it in such a way that I'm saying the two equal each other, aren't I? But they don't. Here's why I know they don't. When two things equal each other, then whatever is true of the one is true of the other. Isn't that the case? So, for example, Superman and Clark Kent, right? They're the same, aren't they? Same person. Okay. So, if Lois Lane loves Clark Kent, then she loves Superman, right? Okay. That's just a logic of identity, right? When A and B are the same, then whatever is true of A is also true of B. Simple logic. All right. So if David is that hunk of marble over there, then what? Then whatever is true of the hunk of marble is true of the statue David. Agreed? Okay. Well, let's say that the statue of David is being moved from, where is it now? I think it's in Florence, right? Yeah. And so it's in Florence. Let's say it's going on exhibit, it's going on a traveling tour to the Louvre or something like that. And as it's being transferred, let's say it gets bumped accidentally, and so it loses a finger. Okay? Has the statue of David stopped existing? No, it's just the statue of David kind of damaged, right? Like Venus de Milo. Okay? It survived, just not completely intact. Agreed? All right. But is it now the same hunk of marble? No. it's missing. Isn't a hunk of marble defined by its material? So if it doesn't have the same material anymore, does it? So it can't be the same hunk of marble, is it? So thus, the statue of David would survive the loss of some material, but the hunk of marble wouldn't. Okay? Now, how does the Taoist approach this? The Taoist says, you're all caught up in the names. You see? You don't understand that the minute I call it a statue, I now define it as a different individual than when I call it a hunk of marble. It's really the naming of it that gives us its existence, doesn't it? But it's not completely like that, see? Because something is being named that before was what? Unnamed. So the reality exists, but its true reality is unnamed, can't be named. But the individual exists because it is named. So thus, you need the nameless and the named, like mother and father, to produce our actual reality that we live in, our human reality. So you see this thing called balance going on? Okay. Put it another way is, you've all heard of yin and yang, haven't you? Okay. So let's turn this around. And does anybody remember the symbol for yin and yang? You've seen it on surfboards before. Right. So let's it's a very impressionistic rendition of it, okay? So please forgive the impoverished artwork. But is that recognizable? Okay. So what is this? This is actually the Taoist picture of what we're reading right here. Okay? It's the picture of what? That reality is a balance of opposites. Okay? You want to say, Confucius wants to say everything can be named, right? Because naming is so useful. When I was telling you the picture of government and society that needs this naming, you were all like, yes, that's great. That's very rational. Okay? But then the problem is you get too rational, and then whatever cannot be defined doesn't exist anymore. Isn't that true? And there are a lot of gray areas. For example, let's go back to the picture of father. Is any father really perfect? So nobody measures up to the ideal of father. No matter how good of a father you are, there's always going to be something you did wrong. Okay? Just ask your wife. And so then, no matter how great of a mother you are, right? There will always be something you did wrong. Just ask your children. So the thing is there are going to be degrees then of mothers and degrees of what? Father. No matter how I define them, there's going to be some people that fall on the borderline, aren't they? That you're going to be like, should I really call him a father? Should I really call him a mother? Should I really call this person a son? So the problem is the minute that I put the name, then the name divides the world into yes and no. But the problem is the world isn't like that, is it? The world is this mutual tension of degrees of opposites. And what Taoists then say is, this picture is to say, look, when you go to the extreme to eliminate the opposite, See, this is the extreme of sunlight. The picture is between sunlight and shadow, yin and yang, okay? Yang is actual sunlight, okay? And yin is moonlight, actually, but then becomes the word for shadow. So the dark and the light, see that? Dark and the light. So let's think about us trying to shed light on things. So right now, the reason why you can see me and distinguish me from this desk is the light that is shining from the light sources onto us, right? And reflecting off into your eyes. Everybody knew that. They just didn't know the theory behind what light waves and stuff, but they knew that. And so now you would think then that you'll be able to see me better the more light you shed on me, right? Oh, up to a point. See? And the thing is you might go, look, because whatever happens is, whatever light is being shed, isn't it casting a shadow? If you have a three-dimensional object, it's going to cast a shadow. So you might say, well, let's eliminate all the shadows, right? So let's put lights all around. And let's make sure every corner of the thing we're looking at says the same level of light shed on it. Okay? You've just eliminated the object, didn't you? In other words, you really can't see through the light without the shadow hiding things. Because otherwise you have no contrast. So when I get to the height of illumination, the height has within it, at its very height, the shadow. Okay? The way in which Laozi put it is this, look, think about hardness. Hardness, you might think, the harder it is, the more difficult it is to penetrate. But couldn't it get so hard that it gets brittle? And therefore, the height of hardness is actually the downfall of hardness, isn't it? And the opposite, right? You might think, getting so dark, so dark, so dark. Yeah, but darkness only exists as the absence of light. So without light, you can't have dark. And without dark, you can't have light. The two define each other. So he puts it like this. He says, look, everybody talks about being. In other words, the stuff that's positive, right? As if this is what's important. But can you have a door without absence? Look at the door over there. Just go look back. Okay? In order to have a door, don't you have to have an absence of wall? In order to have a window, you have to have an absence of wall. Isn't the window therefore defined not by what is, but what is not? And that's everything. Everything. He says it like this with reference to moral terms, like beauty and goodness, which is what the Confucians are emphasizing, right? Beauty, harmony of relationships, right? And goodness, perfect harmony, perfect virtue, doing the right things at the right time, in the right way, to the right people, all of these things. Zen, remember that? And then what? And this is how Laozi defines it. He says, look, everybody knows what makes what is beautiful, beautiful. You know what it is? The ugly. You ever see The Twilight Zone? I don't know if you remember the episode where everybody is beautiful. And therefore what? No one is. Everybody is, because what defines beauty isn't any particular set of characteristics. What defines beauty is those characteristics as something that excels everything else. Isn't that true? And so therefore, if everything has the same amount of beauty, then nothing is what? Beautiful. Just like, can everybody be above average? No, woe begone, right? It's not only woe begone, it's utopia, right? And utopia literally means no place, right? So he then goes on and he says, look, therefore what defines beauty, everybody understands, what defines the beautiful is the ugly, right? It's without the ugly, there is no beauty. And that's not just true in the sense of comparison, it's true also in the sense of like a flower or a rose, right? And when that rose grows up in your garden, it had to grow out of a lot of shit. Right? The fertilizer, the soil is not good looking, is it? You think it's good looking because of what comes out of it. So, thus, everything is relative to its opposite. You see that? He says, look, everybody knows what makes Zen, okay? He says, what makes the good is actually the evil. Okay? Again, because think of what virtue is. Virtue is, if I call somebody courageous, doesn't that mean that they are excelling in their handling of fear? So then can everybody be courageous? No, but then there wouldn't be anybody who excelled. You see? In other words, what makes the virtue Zen admirable and therefore worthy is the fact that it's being compared to, not everybody can do that. Most everybody can't. See? And so now what happens is, this is like grade inflation. How many have heard of the problem of grade inflation? There's been a big thing in Harvard about this, like that. How many heard the story that they did a comparison of the number of A's given back in actually the early, I think it was like the early 2000s. So 2000, and 25% of students in 2000 got A's in Harvard. Now that sounds a lot, doesn't it? Okay? But you know how many now get A's? 60%. Okay? And so this is like the administration sends this report out and they're like, this is terrible, right? And so they want to now start making everything harder, right? Everything harder, because now the A stands for average, right? Exactly. It no longer has the meaning that it had before, right? So thus, everything is this balance of opposites, including good and evil. One of my favorite stories that illustrates this is the story of this peasant, okay? This peasant was very poor, was a farmer though. One year he had this unusually great harvest. So great that actually made him not poor anymore. He was able to sell his crops at a really good price, became prosperous. Okay? And so everybody in the town was like, wow, what a good thing that he had such a great harvest. Right? Okay. Well, so he took the extra proceeds from the harvest and he decided he would buy a stallion. So, because of course, in that culture, to have a horse, and especially a horse that's a stud, he could mate it with other horses, and this would really put him on easy street and prosperous. So he bought this beautiful stallion, one of the most beautiful and enviable horses in the realm. And everybody was like, wow, what a good thing. And then he had a 17-year-old son. And the 17-year-old son decided, I want to ride that stallion. So he rode the stallion, and guess what happened? He got thrown by the stallion, and he became crippled. Couldn't walk anymore. So now everybody in the town said, man, that was a terrible thing that harvest was so good. Because if the harvest hadn't been so good, then he wouldn't have bought the stallion, right? And if he hadn't have bought the stallion, then what? Then his son wouldn't have been crippled. It's a terrible thing that his son got crippled, right? All right, well, a week later, the king's army comes into town. King is off to war, and he is conscripting all of the able-bodied men above 16 in the town. And so, everybody's conscripted, but the son is left behind. A week later, huge battle occurs. The king's army is completely defeated and obliterated. And all the sons in the town are killed. So now, everybody in the town is saying, what about that harvest? That was the best thing that could have ever happened, right? Because if it hadn't happened, then the stallion wouldn't have been bought. And if the stallion hadn't been bought, then the son wouldn't have been crippled. He'd be dead now, probably, from being conscripted into the army. So what do you see here? You see that not only is reality constituted by opposites, reality constantly changes, doesn't it? This makes it hard to name, isn't it? Right? What makes for me as a 6-year-old to be a good little boy should not be the way I behave now. How many agree with that? What made me cute back then would make me insufferable now. Okay? That's what we call Peter Pan, right? So, in other words, reality constantly changes, and therefore you're trying to pin down what's right and wrong. By pinning it down in tradition, what you're doing is ensuring that whatever advice you give is going to be out of date in the next second. Constantly changing, isn't it? So another way to translate 道可道非常道 is the word 常, which is often translated as true, can also mean abiding. Okay? In other words, this Tao, okay, is supposedly the way to navigate reality. Thus the truth. But if reality is constantly changing, the minute I say something about it, it's out of date. The way I allow my students to see this, often when I talk about the subject, is I have them take out their cell phones. And I say, all right, everybody take a picture of one other person. Take a picture. And they love that. They all take a picture, they do selfies and stuff like that. And then what? And I say, okay, now here's the next test. I want you to take a second picture of that same person. But I want the picture to be exactly like the one you took the first time around. How many think they were successful? No, it's impossible, right? They can't imitate the exact same position they were in. And so, thus, if I rely on the picture, it's already out of date. See, but that's what naming is. It's a framing, isn't it? It takes a picture of reality, and by that, we stabilize what can't be stable. Right? So thus, think about this. The nature of reality we can call being, right? And here what we mean by being is not that abstract, metaphysical, Platonic, Aristotelian kind of thing that we think in philosophy. No, we're talking about our being in the world, right? Our way of being, our way of acting, interacting, all that. It's constantly changing. It can't be defined by, because the minute I define it, I exclude its opposite, don't I? Okay? And then that being, because it can't be captured by the kinds of rational processes we use, right? Then what? That's got to change our learning, doesn't it? Our way of understanding the world. And so this Xing of being is also going to X the Confucian way of knowing. Right? And we will deal with that next time. Okay? So we have, wait, let me see how much time I have left. We're till 11:30, right? Okay. Do you want to open up now for questions now? I think so. And then we'll continue on, because I've given you way more than you can ever handle. Okay. So you and then you after. Yes.
I was wondering, when you're talking about possibly translating the Tao into English, which I know you're not, and then how these words have different meanings. The word context.
Ah, yes. That's an excellent point. All right? And that's a very Taoist point. Okay? The reason why is because we often think of the meaning of the whole to be dependent on the meaning of what? The parts. Okay? But that's not the way meaning goes, does it? I'll give you an example, a stupid example. One day I was in the bathroom, and men on the bathroom, they like to write on the walls. Graffiti on the walls. Okay? And I know this is kind of a very potty example, but anyway. So I'm sitting there doing my business, and I'm looking at the wall, curious, you see things written, you read them. And so somebody had written in blue ink, "Bill is kind." Okay? Someone then, with red ink, extended the sentence. He said, "Kind of creepy." Okay. So now, Bill is kind. The word kind is now a compliment, isn't it? But the minute I add that extra context, it now becomes an insult, right? So in other words, meaning is a function not of what the word means in itself, by itself. It's the context, right? That gives that meaning. And that's especially true in translation. So for example, I told you some last time that the way I learned Chinese is I was a Chinese interpreter in the army. And so my whole job was to be a translator. And one thing you learn is the farther apart languages are as families are concerned, right? Like if translating German, I know German too. German is very easy to translate from English, in German to English or whatever. So if you read, for example, Goethe, the most famous German poet, right? He's like the Shakespeare of Germany. And so if you translate Faust, right, into English, you can imitate a lot of the poetry. You can imitate the rhyme schemes, things like that, the meter. Very easy because the languages are so close together. But even there, it can't be completely literal. So now imagine translating Chinese and English, okay? My famous example is a Chinese saying, and this is the Chinese saying, 50步笑100步. Okay, isn't that a beautiful saying? All right, so I'm going to translate it now literally for you, okay? Literally, it means 50 feet laughing at 100 feet. Did that help you at all? No. Maybe. But now let me give you the story, the context that crystallized into this saying. Okay? It actually comes from Chinese philosophy. Remember how Confucius' most famous disciple was a guy named Laozi, Mencius. All right? And he, like Confucius, was an advisor to kings. And so he had this one king that he was consulting with, and the king was really upset because all his citizens were leaving and immigrating to other countries. And he was like, I don't understand this. I don't charge as many taxes as all my other colleagues in the realm. I don't give as much forced labor. I don't take as much from them. I don't rape and pillage as much as everybody else does, right? I'm a way better king, so why is everybody leaving? And Moses says this to him. He says, let me tell you a story, Your Majesty. There was these two armies, and they were fighting each other. Okay? And the one army lost. And the army that lost retreated. Half the army retreated 100 paces. The other half retreated 50 paces. And the half that retreated 50 paces turned around and started making fun of the ones that retreated 100 paces, saying, you're all a bunch of cowards. You retreated. Okay? So now understanding that context, you now know how to translate that saying, right? You're not going to translate it as 50 feet laughing at 100 feet. If you're going to use that as a phrase in Chinese, it now becomes the pot calling the kettle black, right? Or people who live in glass houses, stone shouldn't throw stones. See that? So, in other words, translation is going to be something that's very Taoist, because that same phrase in one context I will have to translate one way, but in another context it will be inappropriate to translate it that way. See? And that's true with any kind of word that you're dealing with. So again, what you see is that everything is this balancing act, isn't it? That the minute we started, this is how Laozi put it. You know when things started to go wrong for morality, he said? He said when people started to ask, what is morality? And then they started to define it. Because let's face it, do we need to define something that everybody understands? No. Do we need to ask what's right and wrong if everybody's doing the right thing? We don't ask the question of what is right and wrong. We don't do academic ethics, philosophy at all if everything's going great. It's only when things are going to shit that you start asking, what is the nature of shit? Okay. And so thus, he says, the problem is things are taken out of context, aren't they? They're taken out of context and they're put out in a pedestal. A light is shined on them, and it's kind of like the old saying, like, if I want to know how a car runs, do I do this? Do I stop the car, open up the hood, and start looking at the engine? Is that going to tell me how the car runs? No. You see? If I want to know how the car runs, I have to actually not open the hood. I have to drive it. But when I'm driving it, I can't analyze it, can I? See? Oh wait, no, it's that sir down there, and then you next. Yes.
Awesome society. The tyrants.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I want to take over.
Yeah.
What does
Excellent question, right? And in fact, this is the question that actually Laozi is trying to answer. He says what makes that possible, tyrants, is the fact that people believe they can control things. Okay? So think about this. Why do I want to define things? Because when I define it, I put a fence around it, don't I? And then I understand its characteristics. Think of science. Okay? My best example is actually psychology here. We're going to seem like we're changing the subject, but we're not. How many heard of applied behavioral analysis? Okay? This is the most popular type of therapy these days in philosophy, in psychology. All right? Why is it popular? Because it's very scientific. And what do I mean by that? If I'm going to do science, I have to define everything, don't I? So which means I have to define things in such a way that I can experiment on them. Okay? For example, if my theory has no observable consequences, can I do experiments? No. So what I'm going to need, if I'm going to do psychology as a science, you see this? Is I'm going to need to be able to define mental states in ways that are visible to everybody. Okay? So how do I determine your mental states if I'm not you? How do I determine them? What do you do, right? Your behavior. So for example, if I'm walking around and all of a sudden I go, ugh, what are you going to now believe about what's going on in me? That I am in pain, right? That I'm suffering. I could be just a great actor. Right? You see, in other words, it's very easy to knock the theory of behaviorism down. Because it assumes, what it does is define, it actually literally defines mental states in terms of their behavior or their tendency toward behavior. Why? Because it's very malleable. It's very controllable. So if I want to now cure autism, right? I'm not going to be able to cure what's going on in here. I'm going to have to make that person assimilate, right? And the way to assimilate is to reward and punish behavior, right? Stimulus and response. And so if I'm going to do science, I'm going to need to get control over the experimental situation. Therefore, I have to define everything in terms of things that are controllable. Therefore, science, since Francis Bacon, who is the real sort of, you might say he was like the Thomas Jefferson of science. Thomas Jefferson was to the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, right? He was the one who set the sort of ideas that then motivated the Constitution, right? Francis Bacon in his New Atlantis and in the New Instauration, okay, redefined what knowledge was in terms of what we can experiment on. So once you get that idea, right, that's what makes science able to be done. Control everything. Define everything, humans, all things in terms of observable consequences. And that's how we get computers, technology, right? And it's great for technology, but it's terrible for determining what reality is like. Because what do you have to do? You have to cut up what you're observing, don't you? You have to put the engine on idle to see how the car runs. And so now, what's Laozi's response? Because he was going around at the very same time that Chinese science is going on, you see this? His response is, your problem is you're trying to control, you're trying to define, you're trying to put nature and reality in your limits. And by doing that, you truncate it, you destroy it, you destroy balance, don't you? And then so if you're going to be a good ruler, the good ruler does not want his subjects to have too much science. Okay? Here's why. It's called FOMO. Anybody hear of FOMO before? All right. FOMO is the millennial term for fear of missing out. You all know this, because how many remember the days before cell phones? Yeah, we all grow up, right? We all remember that, right? Did you miss cell phones when you didn't have them? You didn't. In fact, I didn't miss it until 2015. I refused to have, I had one of those cell phones that you could only talk into, that didn't have even texting. And everybody was texting, and I'm like, it's like you're going backwards. That was the telegraph. Right? Now voices come out of this thing. Isn't it amazing? You can talk into it, and the things talk out. They come back. Instead, you're going back to the, all right? And so I was like this Luddite. I didn't until I was forced, until my wife forced me to buy a smartphone. Right? And it was the dumbest thing I ever did. Why? Well, because the minute I got all these new capabilities, didn't it produce a bunch of new desires? A bunch of new needs? Can anybody live without a cell phone these days? They can't. Nobody can live without a computer these days, can they? So what happens is this. This is what Laozi says. He says, listen, you keep people in their simplest state, and they're going to have the fewest number of desires. And in fact, they're going to have the desires that nature gave them. And those desires are actually already gauged to nature. So they're satisfiable, and there are few. Aren't people in general going to be more happy? So you say, yeah, but they don't know what they're missing out on, right? They don't know what they're missing out on. That's the problem. So you now create all these technologies, right? Like you create jewels and luxury. Is everybody going to be able to have the jewels and the luxury? No, because you're going to have to do an enormous distribution of resources, right? And concentration of resources to get that, right? Think of any great civilization. You know, and actually, let's think of North America. North America, and this is an old statistic, it's actually worse now. The old statistic was back in the 1990s that North America has 16% of the world's population, and it uses 64% of the world's resources. And that makes sense, because if you're talking about the enormous infrastructure that goes into the average American's lifestyle, you need to have that concentration of resources, don't you? Okay? But this is true for every civilization. You think when Egypt was building the pyramids, everything was equal? No, you needed enormous amounts of conscripted slave labor, didn't you? All to build a tomb for one guy. Right? But we go back and we look at it and go, isn't that amazing? Or think of the Great Wall. When I went to the Great Wall, last time I was in China, it was what was amazing. Anybody been to the Great Wall? Okay, it's a great wall, isn't it? Okay. What was one thing that amazed me, and I didn't realize this until I did some research, is that if you look at the cracks in between the bricks and the stones, you see that the cement is white. Everybody ever notice that? The cement is bone white. And here's why. Because it's got a lot of calcium in it. A lot of calcium. And guess where the calcium came from? Bones. Because this is what would happen when people died while they were building the wall, right? Hundreds of thousands died building this wall. Is they were just thrown in with the cement there. Yeah. Look. This is why the philosopher Nietzsche said you can't have equality, because with equality there's no greatness, is there? Right? So, but then Laozi is saying, yeah, so the cost of all your technology, of all your control, right, is the vast misery of the great majority. Right? And you think, yeah, but we got longer lives, we got all of these things. Yeah, you got longer lives, and let's face it, as you get older, don't you feel like life is kind of like the end of a toilet paper, right? That you ever notice that when you get to the end of the toilet paper, it goes what? Faster? Yeah. I know, but it's now I never use it to the end. I like take it. It's the thing is so Laozi is saying, here's the problem. Here's how tyranny comes. Tyranny comes because you increase desire. And when you increase the amounts of desire, you have to increase the amount of desire for control over other people and things, don't you? Because let's face it, what happens with technology is the whole thrust of it is to give you more control over nature. And therefore, you are creating, he says, with these diamonds and gold and all of these things, what you create is greed. Right? Without that, there can be no greed. With these iPhones and computers and AI bots and chat bots and all of these things, weren't they created to become our slaves so that we didn't have to do a lot of work? Isn't that the thrust of most technology, is the drive to be lazy? The drive for personal peace and prosperity. And then the interesting thing is then it becomes the new baseline, doesn't it? And so it really doesn't increase our ease. It increases the number of expectations that are placed upon us. You see? Go back before cell phones. Isn't it true that if somebody couldn't contact you because you weren't in the office, they didn't expect to be able to contact you? Only those people who had the little buzzards, because they were 24/7, were expected to be. But nowadays, if you don't answer a text in 2 to 3 minutes, you are rude.
The roles have been reversed related to our phone.
Exactly. So thus, the desire to enslave nature has made us slaves, hasn't it? The desire to become greater than humans could be through the things that technology makes us do, right, beyond our humanity, has actually made us subhuman. Think about that. One of the greatest statistics is this, is that these recent chatbots, right, that large language models, some of you might know that I run the PhD program in technology and humanities. Okay, and one of the biggest things that have been shown in the most recent studies of student and actually just general public use of LLMs, of AI, is that it is destroying the ability of people to think on their own. Their cognitive skills are being destroyed. It makes absolute sense. If I give you if I say, look, I'm going to make a pair of artificial legs for you, and these legs are going to run faster than your natural legs, they're going to make you run farther, faster, all of these things, right? And so you put them on. What's going to happen to your normal legs? They're going to atrophy. You don't use it, you lose it. Okay? And so, thus, what we've done, believe it or not, I am answering your question, hopefully, is that he's saying the problem with tyranny and all these little monarchs that are trying to fight each other, right, to gain supreme mastery over the empire, is that the problem is you have given them, you have given people through your development of technology and through the development of this kind of knowledge that we're going to talk about next time, analytical knowledge, the learning of Confucius and the Moists, is you've created in them desires that can only be satisfied by controlling others. And thus, you create the impulse toward tyranny. Because isn't the tyrant just a human being who's given too much power? Okay? And, I mean, the old saying is power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? And that in general is true. Maybe there are a few people that that's not true, but for most of us, I'm glad I'm not as rich as I could be. I really am. Yeah, exactly. See? So, thus, I would say Laozi is actually answering throughout all this metaphysical stuff the real political question, see? He's hearkening back to a simpler error, and this is what he's saying. He said, Confucius, you are right, we got to go back to the past. But it's not to go back to the past of civilization, it's actually to go before civilization. It's civilization and all of this naming and standardization and learning that is destroying us. Okay? And you might say, wow, I can't accept that. But it's hard to argue with the results. This was, and he wasn't the only one in the East to do this. Actually, thousands of years later, at the height of the scientific revolution, a guy named Rousseau, I mean, you've heard of Rousseau, right? He became famous not for his discourse on government, actually. He became famous for an essay contest that he won. And this essay was the Academy of Sciences of Anjou gave this topic that they gave to everybody, an essay contest topic, and it was, has the development of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment of science and technology and the arts and civilization, has that helped us morally or hurt us morally? And he was the only one to argue it's destroying us. This was his first discourse. You've all heard of his second discourse. It's his first discourse. And this is what made him famous, because he became a lightning rod on this. And he actually won the contest. The Academy of Sciences thought his arguments were so interesting that, and when you look at his arguments, they sound a lot like Laozi. They sound a lot like the Taoist arguments. But what makes them more palpable is here he's in the middle of the development of all the things he's criticizing. Whereas he could always say, well, Laozi, you didn't know what you're talking about. You were using wood to like wipe your butt, right, or something. So yeah. You had a question, sir.
I'm not sure I've got this. It seems to me that Confucianism seeks to define everything.
Mm-hmm.
And the Taoists get down to an element undefinable.
Mm-hmm.
In Western culture, that led to the notion of a supreme being. Because it was undefinable, we needed to find a way to rationalize that.
Yeah.
It did not grow up in Chinese culture.
Right.
Correct?
Yes. Well, no, it's very interesting because, again, what you have is these conflicting impulses, right? The Confucians actually did believe in a supreme God. They just didn't want to talk about it because they saw it as impractical. So, indeed, how many ever heard of a thing called the heavenly mandate? Okay? That's a Confucian idea. And it's the idea, because before the Zhou dynasty, their main god was a sky god. It was called Tian. Okay? And so it's often translated in the Chinese text as heaven. And so, thus, they did believe in this sort of like cosmic divine order that you should be following. The Confucians did believe that, but they didn't think it was essential to serve it or to have a direct relationship. They had more of the idea of what Aristotle would have toward the God that he proved. And that is, God is so above us that God could care less about us. Okay? Indeed, the Greek idea of gods were, look, they're perfect, right? So if they're perfect, then they can't have any love. Because to love something is to desire it. And when you desire something, do you have it? And if you love somebody, you love what's good in them, right? So thus, if the gods had love, then they would love the good and therefore not have it. But they're supremely good, so they should be self-satisfied, right? So you might say that thus the God of Aristotle, the God of philosophers, is this source of everything, creates the cosmic order, and grounds the moral order, but sacrificing to that God, doing anything, is meaningless. And you could see a similar attitude in Mengzi and others. They talk about the ground, the heavenly ground of government. But the way heaven gets mad is just humans messing things up. So thus, for example, the reason we know a king does not have the heavenly mandate, that they're a tyrant, is things start going terribly. So, for example, if the king is devoting all resources to personal pleasure, is he repairing the dikes and the irrigation canals? No. Right? And so what's going to happen? You're going to get floods. And those floods are going to destroy society, right? And so you're going to have all sorts of famine, you're going to have all sorts of stuff, and that's the sign that heaven is mad. Okay? So what is heaven? Heaven is just the cosmic order that grounds everything, but it's humans, as Confucius said it like this, he says, it's not humans, it's not the Tao that creates humans, it's humans that create the Tao. So you have that, and then you have the Moists. And they were the ones that were fighting against the Confucius, right? The lower class craftsmen. And they actually did believe in a monotheistic, supreme kind of emperor god. And they argued that that's what made Confucianism bad, is that they were atheistic in that sense.
Not surprising.
Yeah. So in other words, it's very complex, but what happens is the combination of Daoism and Confucianism winning out over that then creates this lack of concern about the next life and religion and all that. It's not that they don't have it, it's that the religion is more about the feelings it produces among people in society than, okay, where am I going when I die, right? Okay, so now we are at 11:32, and to be continued. Thank you. Thank you all.
I'd like to ask you a question. Now, read the papers, you hear, oh, China, China. I unfortunately have never been to China. But middle of China, what is life like for them? Are they, I mean, my God, you see what they're building. It's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
amazing and whatever. But what